Good afternoon, apes in the jungle. We are so honored today to have the founder of Gold Money. He's also a director. His name is Mr. James Turk, and anyone, unless you're living under a rock, has read his articles. They're frequently published by a variety of people. And he has a recent book that was titled Money and Liberty. And we're going to be reading that, and we're going to show you where you can get a copy, either a PDF download or an ebook or a hard copy or paperback, I imagine. And let's get right into the book. So James, why did you write the book, and what is this? You've written a few books?
I've written several books over the years. A couple of them I co-authored with John Rubino, who's a good friend of mine. First one was written in 2004.
So tell us about Money and Liberty specifically.
Yeah, it's the accumulation of all of the knowledge that I've built up over the past 50 years in my variety of positions that I've held, from banking, trading, investment management, etc. And the key is that I wrote it for my two sons. I have two boys, and I also have three grandchildren. I wrote it for them so that they could understand, what I'd learned over the past 50, 55 years. And the most important point being that money, and when I talk about money, I'm talking about natural money, which is gold. And we can explain why gold is money if you want to get into that. But why gold and liberty are inextricably interlinked. You can't have one without the other. So if we look back at the 20th century, for example, we saw that gold was confiscated by Lenin in Russia, Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, and Roosevelt in the United States. Why did they confiscate gold? They wanted to get it out of the hands of the people so that they could have control of the monetary system. And when they have control of the monetary system, liberty disappears, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but it does disappear inevitably.
Okay, so I'm seeing here that this was sort of a legacy piece of journalism, or as an author, you wrote it with Mr. Rubino. We're very big fans of his work.
This one I wrote by myself. John, the previous ones I did with John, but this one I wanted to go out on my own because it was really just my own experience. And the whole quest of, the subtitle of the book is The Pursuit of Happiness and the Theory of Natural Money. And for me, my life has been the pursuit of happiness, which is what everybody should be doing. Aristotle said happiness is the reason for being. And we want to live our lives the best we can within natural law, and be happy. And the way you are happy is to have honest money. And unfortunately, we don't have honest money today, but I'm hoping that the book itself will provide the educational material as to why honest money is an essential ingredient to happiness.
So in the case of Lenin, Mussolini, Hitler, Roosevelt, and we all know that we all fit on different sides of the spectrum. This is not a political discussion, but why would you think that by confiscating gold, what was the end game in mind for the ruling class at the time?
Yeah, well, if you take money out of the hands of the people, then government rules. If you have gold or silver, for that matter as well, people can transact with themselves, pursuing their happiness. What we need to understand is that as individuals, we have to be self-reliant. We have to take care of our own needs and our needs of our family. And those include, having a shelter, having food, having clothing. And we work in order to earn purchasing power. And this is the key element that a lot of people lose sight of. But we work to earn purchasing power, and that purchasing power is then used to spend for things that we need, and if we've accumulated some capital, what we want, or to invest. And it's that process that's so important to achieving individual liberty. But if you take purchasing power and put it in the hands of the government, which is what happens today through the fiat currency system that we have, that purchasing power can be manipulated by government to its own ends. It's manipulated through inflation. It's manipulated in ways in which we can or cannot move that purchasing power from one country to another, or from one person to another person. And it's getting worse if we go with central bank digital currencies, which would put even more control on the freedom of individuals to act and do what they want with their purchasing power. Now, the important point is I'm talking about purchasing power, and it's conveyed through money. And it's best conveyed through natural money, which is gold principally, and silver to a certain extent as well. But if that purchasing power is conveyed through fiat currency, which is currency that comes out of banks and central banks, the government and the banks can control that to their own advantage, to the disadvantage of the individuals who are using it.
Okay, so I picked up on another theme. You had mentioned that Aristotle had said, the quote was that he wanted people to live a life to make them happy. Give me the quote itself.
I don't remember the exact words. It's in the book, but it's basically, happiness is the key to life.
Okay, that's fine. That seems like an emotion to be happy. You could probably write a book on that, I bet. And
yeah, we could. And the thing is that happiness to me may be different than happiness to you or happiness to other individuals. And that's the whole thing about the way we live in a civil society. We harmoniously, voluntarily work with one another in order to achieve happiness. Because when we enter into a transaction without any kind of force or fraud being involved, we both benefit from that transaction. In other words, the farmer sells food to get money in order to use that money to buy something else. And we all work in order to produce and create that purchasing power that makes the world go around. And unfortunately, the more governments get involved in the monetary process, the less free we become. And we're seeing that day to day as countries around the world move to greater government control. And like I said, some move fast, like Venezuela, and some move slowly, like what's happening in the United States.
How would you suggest then, I don't think, James Turk, I've ever seen the name anarchist next to your name anywhere, but it almost seems like if government has other functions, let's say fire protection, police protection, education, highways, dams, other critical infrastructure, or even the care of children. Do children have the right to be happy? In terms of what if they have poor parenting and they need the government to subsidize their food, shelter, and clothing? How would gold be able to do that?
Yeah, well, you're asking a very complex question, but basically, let me go back to natural law and what happened when America won its independence and disassociated itself from the feudalist system that had been prevailing in Europe for hundreds of years. We became independent, we became free. And if you look at natural law, as I explained in the book, as a waterfall, we, the individuals, are on top of the waterfall. We then delegate some authority to the state, and the state then delegates authority to the federal government. What's happened in the 20th century, since Roosevelt particularly, Franklin Roosevelt particularly, that waterfall has been turned upside down. The federal government thinks it's on top, which can delegate to the state, which in turn delegates to the people. That's not the way it works. My point is that the closer the government is to the individual, the better it's going to be. So if you have people who are taking care, people in a local community, and they see a child is being abused or not receiving the education that they should be receiving, that's a local issue. That's not a federal issue, because the local people can deal with that matter much more thoughtfully and react more quickly than bureaucrats in Washington.
So the answer would be to abolish the federal government and just everyone be involved in local.
No, that's not the answer. The answer is to do what the Constitution says we can do. What the Constitution did, there were 13 sovereign states that became free and sovereign after the War of Independence. And the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the King George acknowledged that each of the 13 former colonies were sovereign states with the same power as the British Empire. So what these states did is they recognized that standing alone was not the answer. They had to find some kind of way of working together in order to solve a common defense, because Britain was still in the Caribbean and in Canada. And in fact, Britain invaded in 1812 for a second time. And that war ultimately was won by America. So the common defense was one of the three elements of the Constitution. Another element of the Constitution was to have a common market, much like the European common market was after the Second World War, to eliminate the barriers between the 13 different states. And the third element, which was perhaps the most important, was to have a common currency or common money, which the Constitution says is gold and silver coin. Congress has the power to coin money. It doesn't have the power to print money. And if it doesn't have the power specifically delegated in the Constitution, it can't give that power to someone else, like the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court has never ruled on that. They've avoided the issue, but in fact, it is an unconstitutional institution if you read the letter of the law. So Congress has the power to coin money, coin gold and silver, and regulate the value thereof. Now, what that means and what the framers of the Constitution intended it to mean is that Congress can regulate the gold-silver ratio to make sure that there's sufficient gold or sufficient silver in the country at all times for coinage. Because if the ratio gets out of whack, the currency or the coin that's undervalued will be exported, and then that would leave a shortage of currency of that particular coin. And in fact, in 1837, Congress did regulate the ratio by moving it to a 16.7 to the more famous 16 to 1, 16 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold ratio. So we have to go back to what the framers of the Constitution left. I mean, they were absolutely brilliant in terms of the structure that they created and put us on the right path. But in the 20th century, because of demagogues and dishonest leaders who led us in the wrong direction, we've lost the sight of what the framers really created for America.
Well, since some of those people are dead now, let's go ahead and name names. Do you mind? I mean, I'm trying to think when we wandered off task in terms of wandering off, let's just call it the Constitution. But before we get to that, can you think of a country or a nation or any sovereign, including indigenous lands, that does have a system of sound money that's out there right now?
No. The whole world is basically on a fiat currency system. We've abandoned traditional economics, classical economics. We've abandoned the wisdom of people like Adam Smith. We've abandoned the wisdom of the framers of the Constitution who understood what honest money was. And as a consequence, pretty much starting in the late 19th century, we veered off into the wrong direction. And where we are today is we're trying to keep this unsustainable system afloat with $33 trillion of debt in America alone. And that's just the direct debt. It doesn't include another 100 trillion of contingent liabilities. It's unsustainable. It's lasted longer than I thought. I thought when John and I wrote our book, The Coming Collapse of the Dollar in 2004, that the crisis that would appear or was likely to appear and did in fact appear in 2007 would be the ending crisis to put us back on the right direction. But they've managed to keep the bubble that much longer in the air. But the more you defer the problem and the more you defer coming up with a solution to the problem, the bigger the bust is eventually going to be.
Who was the president that said, some people say that he never said it, but he was afraid he sold his soul to the private bankers, the people the creatures of Jekyll Island, whoever they were.
Yeah, that's Woodrow Wilson. I've never verified it, whether it's accurate or not, but
you've heard that quote, though.
Yes, I've heard the quote. I've heard a lot of other quotes as well related to various presidents who.
Yeah, that's true. But if it's unconstitutional, and can't we introduce a bill saying let's feel free to adhere to the Constitution? I mean, I guess that seems like,
of course, of course we could do that. But I mean, we have a lot of hypocrisy in the country. People swear to the Constitution. They probably never even read it. And even if they read it, very few understand the monetary provisions of the Constitution or are unwilling to take the political leadership to go back in the right direction. And as a consequence, we're heading toward the cliff. And, when you're heading toward a cliff, sooner or later, you're going to get there. You can't predict when, but it's an inevitable conclusion that you will go over the cliff if you're going in the wrong direction. And we are, because the debts are unsustainable. We're seeing it already in terms of the way the currency is being debased. one of the things that happened after the Constitution was approved, one of the first acts of Congress was the Mint Act of 1792. And at that moment in time, and pretty much up until the 19th century, inflation was considered a crime against humanity because you were destroying the mechanism by which people would communicate value with one another as they entered into the free market. So it said in the Coinage Act of 1792 that it was a felony penalty by death if you debased the currency. And
the clippers, didn't the coin clippers suffer a certain punishment similar to that?
Yeah, it was basically, there's a long history that if you debase the currency, you get it's a felony.
So quantitative easing should be a felony.
Yes, and 2% every year, that shouldn't be a target. That should be an outrage that people would accept this 2% stealth tax that the government's charging against people by inflating away the currency. And I don't think we'll ever see 2% again. There's a lot of cheering that the Fed's going to lower interest rates, but they can't go higher on interest rates because the government's debt burden is already so great. You're paying a high percentage of the U.S. government expenses just to meet the interest expense.
So I believe, isn't it the highest line item in our budget right now? I think.
Yeah, and it's going to get higher because a lot of the debt that's maturing is maturing into shorter term maturities, and eventually as a 2% note matures, it's then replaced by a 5% note. Right. So it's getting worse, and that's why I say the system's unsustainable. And I think while I was wrong in 2004 that the next crisis was going to be the final one, I think this next crisis that's been building, when the bubble pops this time, it took 750 billion back in 2008 to bail out. This time, it's hard to believe when you're running an annual deficit of 2 trillion, which is what the deficit is going to be in this current fiscal year of the government. It's just mind-boggling to think what's going to happen when this system does blow up this next time in the next crash. And to me, it's just a matter of time, and that's what we have to prepare for. We don't know when these things are going to happen. It's just like, with stocks. You buy them when they're undervalued. You don't know how long it's going to take before that valuation becomes fully recognized by the market. So you just have to be patient. Same thing with this system too. You just have to be patient and be prepared for when it comes, so that you and your family can continue to live the life that you've worked so hard to reach.
Now, we've been in this commodity bear run for a while. They always have sort of a graph where you can see when these things turn around in terms of commodities being undervalued. What would you see as a signal that perhaps we'll enter a commodity bull run?
Well, I think we've already seen the signal. I think the bottom in commodities occurred after the pandemic. Okay. We've been basically working our way higher. I mean, look at crude oil, which was minus $30 after the pandemic, is now, over $90 a barrel. Gasoline is in the States, in some places is approaching, $4 a gallon. And as I understand it, as we were discussing beforehand, in California, it's even worse than that. So, yeah, I think the commodity cycle has already started. And these are not short-term cycles. They tend to last for a long period of time. So, for example, we saw the 1970s as a 10-year cycle. And I think where commodities were booming. And I think we're at the beginning of another, long-term cycle in the benefit of commodities. Yeah, I'm glad you put that chart up, because to me, it's one of the most important things to explain why gold is money. What this is the price of West Texas Intermediate crude oil from 1950 to the present. And the key point is that an ounce of gold or a gram of gold buys the same amount of crude oil today as it did 70 years ago. It shows how gold preserves purchasing power over long periods of time, compared to the other three currencies on this graph, which are the blue is the British pound, green is the US dollar, and the purple one is the euro. But notice the euro from 2000, when the euro was created, to the present, is very similar to the other two currencies. Up to 2000, this chart actually measures the Deutschmark, which, along with the Swiss franc, have been the only two reasonably well-managed currencies, who understood the point that inflation is a crime against humanity and a theft of purchasing power from people.
Yeah, this is a brilliant chart, and I thank you for, I've been a fan of this chart because it sort of does tell, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, and I would say this is one of them.
Yeah.
And when I think, go ahead.
The interesting thing about this chart, though, John, is why does gold preserve purchasing power over long periods of time? Very few people really ask that question, but the answer is very, very simple. The above ground stock of gold, because gold is accumulated, commodities are consumed. That's why gold, I don't call gold a commodity. I call it money, which is an asset class in its own right. Commodities are consumed and disappear, but all of the gold mined throughout history still exists in its above ground stock, mostly in the form of coins, bars, and high carat jewelry. And it's accumulated because it's money. So gold's above ground stock, which is what I call gold's M3, the total quantity of gold that's in existence, is grows at approximately the same rate as world population growth, about 1.5% per annum. And the interesting thing is that it does that over, I traced it in one of my books back, I think it even mentions in Money and Liberty. It happens because of the way gold is dispersed in the Earth's crust. It's only mined when it's profitable to do so. These fiat currencies are created whenever politicians and central bankers want to create them. That makes a world of difference between these two different types of things, between fiat currency and between gold. Now, the interesting thing is it dispersed in the Earth's crust by chance, or is it the intelligent design of some creator? I don't want to get into religious thinking or any of that aspect of it. It's up to each individual to figure that out for themselves. But it does exist. It is factual, and it cannot be denied. And that's why gold preserves purchasing power over long periods of time. And because it's accumulated, gold is money.
So if we take I hear what you're saying there. I think I like the way you describe it. I always like the way you speak. And I've heard it described as sort of a stock to flow ratio in terms of how much mining activity a year is against the above ground inventory, which you say is tied to world population. So if we're at 8 billion, are we saying there's an ounce for each person in a way, or is it less?
In a way, yeah. Or over this, 70 year period of time, the above ground stock of gold, I think, is slightly more than doubled over that period of time at a 1.5% growth rate. So basically, the same amount of gold today per person is the same amount of gold 70 years ago per person.
Okay, that makes sense. So that's when we speak about the hardness of money. We're not saying if you bite on it, it's hard, because gold is fairly soft, but we mean it's hard to produce, right?
Yes. It's only produced when it's profitable to produce it. And again, that gets back to how it's dispersed in the Earth's crust. And the same thing is true for silver. And just one thing on silver, it's not on this chart, but I always like to tell the story of growing up in the States in the 1950s. And my parents could drive into the local gas station and fill up the family car with $2 worth of silver coins. Today, if you take $2 worth of silver coins, of the pre-1965 silver coins, or $2 silver, and you look at the silver content, you can still fill up the family car with the silver content of $2 silver. So again, this is also true for silver in terms of preserving purchasing power. But silver, because it's also used in industrial components, it makes the relationship to gold a little bit more volatile. So the gold-silver ratio does fluctuate. And at the moment, at 84 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold, silver is very, very cheap. And I've been very bullish on silver, waiting for this thing to break much higher. And I think that's going to happen in the not too distant future, surely within the next 12 months.
Wow. You heard it here, folks. That's very big news to Wall Street Silver and to SilverDegenClub. In both cases, we use the word silver. It's sort of a departure from Wall Street bets and GameStop and all that stupid meme stock stuff. We wanted to stay focused on real money versus speculative financial instruments like stocks.
Yeah,
with the exception of some mining stocks. There are some good mining stocks.
As I said before, though, just to follow up on that, We
Okay.
can't predict the future. All we need to do is buy the stuff that's undervalued and be patient. But I think we've reached a stage where the patience has been so long now that just a little bit of up movement in the silver is going to bring a lot of money in off of the sidelines, because people will start to recognize how undervalued it is. And when I talk about silver and talk about gold, I'm talking about physical silver and physical gold, not paper representations of them. You actually want to own the real thing. And that's very, very important, because when you own the real thing, you don't have any counterparty risk. You don't have any risk that the metal that you own, it's not going to be defaulted upon. You want to own it, physical metal.
Who was the first one that brought counterparty to the party?
Bank of England. Actually, credit goes back to Babylonian times. Credit's been a function of human history and markets and
Right.
dealing with one another. And what credit means is that you're accepting the credit worthiness of another individual to give you back what you lend to them. And history is replete with examples of banks failing, governments failing, promises failing. Just like the governments around the world today, they've made promises that they can't possibly fulfill, simply because there's not enough money in the world to fulfill all of those promises. But we live in this bubble mentality. We think that the governments are going to solve it all. I'll tell you an interesting story. Back in the early 1990s, just before the Soviet Union collapsed, if you had gone into the middle of Moscow and said you had perfect vision, and in 1 year's time, the Soviet Union was going to collapse and the ruble would be worthless, people would have laughed at you and said that the government won't let it happen. And it's the same kind of mentality
Right.
that you see around the world today. People say the government won't let it happen, but that's not the way the real world works. Collapses do occur. Credit worthiness is a key component, and promises are very often broken, particularly when the bubble pops.
Now, you used to be a banker. Do you think it should be illegal to promote a bank run?
That's a really interesting question, because if you look at and I've read I've got a lot of books in my library on the history of banking and what has occurred in terms of the relationship to the law. In most places, it's considered illegal and a crime to make accusations about a bank that would be deemed to be a cause of a bank run. But as an analyst, if you keep your report factual, it's just an element of free speech.
Okay.
You can't make anything slanderous or libelous that would cause it. But if it's factually based, there's no reason that a person can't say what they believe to be true and base it upon facts that can be verified as accurate facts. The basic issue, John, is that the way banking is practiced is they're inherently insolvent. And the reason why I say that is that the liabilities, which are the fiat currency that's in circulation around the world, are backed by assets that tend to be long-term. So you have short-term liabilities and long-term assets. And we saw this play out with Silicon Valley Bank. They looked solvent, but they were inherently insolvent because they had liabilities that were payable on demand, funding assets that were payable in 5, 10, in some cases, more years than that. So you have this situation that banks are inherently insolvent. And during periods of stress, when banks have become over-leveraged and economic conditions become severe and people start to doubt the creditworthiness of other people or banks or whatever, money is taken out of the banks. And this is what happened in the 1930s. But the 1930s was interesting because we were still on a gold standard until the confiscation by Roosevelt. So money was taken out of the banks. It was first turned into paper currency, paper dollars, because we had gold certificates back then and silver certificates. And then because the credit worthiness during the Depression became so doubted, people weren't happy with the government representation of what this gold certificate or silver certificate was. They wanted to get rid of the paper and go into the real thing, physical gold and silver. And that's when Roosevelt ended up confiscating the gold and silver. He didn't need to do that. All he needed to do is devalue the dollar from $20.67 to something around my calculation was $37, and he would have brought an end to the bank run. But he didn't do that. He chose to confiscate the gold and take it out of the hands of the people to go on the same path that was being followed in Europe at that time.
Okay, this is your last question, and it's
Sure.
sort of a follow-up to what you just said. I had this thing where I'm not going to attack Mr. Roosevelt. In fairness to him, he did say, we'll buy it from you. But tell me that story. Didn't it go from 25 to 35, or what was the?
Yeah, he bought it at $20.67.
And then what happened?
And then he devalued the dollar afterward.
Okay.
Which is, inherently dishonest.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And the other thing that was dishonest about it is that, as I understand it, there was a lot of inside knowledge about what he was going to do. So if you look at the gold flows out of the United States in 1931 and before the election in 1932, a lot of gold flowed out to Europe that was owned by Americans, because they only confiscated gold that was in banks in the States. You can't confiscate gold that's in some place else in the world. So a lot of the gold went out of the United States before he actually confiscated it.
Well, you try telling Cortez you can't confiscate gold that's outside your borders, or Pizarro, or I guess Muammar Gaddafi. Anyway, that's off topic. Last question, Mr. Turk. You're such a delightful man, and your IQ is so far north of mine. I'm very honored that you're here.
I just have a lot of experience. I've been at this for 55 years. I've learned from my mistakes, and I'm happy to share my experiences.
Thank you. It's just such a delightful visit. But the last question is, and this is something that I think is misunderstood, including by an old guy like me that still wants to learn from someone like you. And the question is the following: why is a strong dollar, or a relatively strong dollar, a headwind for gold?
Yeah, that's really a good question, and I'll try to answer it as quickly and as simply as possible.
No, I think it's a riddle almost, isn't it?
To a certain extent, yeah. What people immediately come back with is they say, well, you get this 5% interest rate when you hold dollars, assuming you can get that kind of interest rate. I mean, savings rates are only 0.5% or 1% at most in most banks in the States these days. But let's assume you can get a 5% interest rate and you buy T-bills or something like that. That interest rate is not for free. It comes with risk. It comes with risk that the currency is going to be inflated away. And, is the inflation rate higher than 5% today? I think it may very well be, with crude oil slipping back above $90 a barrel. So what you have to do is compare a dollar bill or a $10 bill, to gold. That's the comparison. It's a circulating medium. You can lend gold if you have it and the banks are willing to borrow it, which they are, but you typically have to have $10 million or more worth of gold for the banks to even be interested in borrowing gold from you. And then you can earn 0.5% or something like that. But is the credit worthiness of that 5% that you're earning really worth it in a time when we're in a bubble and there's a lot of stress within the financial system? I don't think so. Remember, it took Paul Volcker interest rates, a prime bank rate of over 20% in the early 1980s, to restore confidence in the dollar. Now, this time you got the media working with the government and the central banks to maybe make 5% sound good, but in reality, the problems that we face today are much greater than what Volcker was facing back then. Back then, the U.S. was the largest creditor nation in the world. The government deficits were bad, but they weren't that bad. Now we're the largest debtor nation in the universe, and the federal deficits are horrendous, $2 trillion a year, and likely to get worse. So it's a very different set of circumstances. 5%, in my mind, is not sufficient compensation to hold paper instead of holding physical gold.
That's true. They do have the media helping them. They also have some gold bashers like Harry Dent and Brent Johnson and Dave Ramsey. But these are my opinions, not Mr. Turk's. So with that said, James, just hang out for a second afterwards, just so I can tell you again how much I appreciated you coming on and teaching the Pickaxe, Wall Street Silver, and the SilverDegenClub, and all our subscribers. Remember, in the description field, you will see links to obtain your copy of Money and Liberty, I'd highly recommend. This man's a brilliant scholar. I never miss a podcast that he's on. I usually catch him on King World News, where a lot of our other heroes are there, such as Alistair McLeod and Gerald Salente and people like that. So that being said, I bid you adieu, and it was our honor. You're going to light up the internet, sir. You're just the best.
Thank you, John. It's been really fun. I really appreciate what you're doing to help educate people about silver, particularly, but about money and the broader economy. I think education is the key. What we learn in school these days is not what should be taught when it comes to economics and honest money. And that's what gold and silver are all about: honest money and return to constitutional money, as is required by our Constitution.